Hi, this is Jan Spencer here in Eugene, Oregon. Thanks for joining us. I must boast a little bit. We are having perhaps maybe the best fall fig production that I'm aware of here in this middle part of October here in Eugene. Figs are just going off. I've got more figs than I can deal with. It's a nice problem to have. I love figs. Okay, well, this is part three of a four-part series. Actually, it's going to be a five-part series. Let's move to screen share. Here we are, four-part series. Permaculture in action, creating a preferred future. We've had two presentations already, and this is the third. We had already a fourth planned. I'm going to do a fifth presentation, given that part of what I was planning on presenting today, I'd like to take an entire session for that. I've been doing some new thinking on reaching out to the wider world and a reset conversations. We'll hear a little bit more about that. So this is part three. What we're going to do today is a little review of parts 1 and 2. And then today, part 3, we're going to take a look at block planning and pushing back on cars. One of my favorite topics, absolutely. And then let me just mention presentation 4, which will be next week, next Saturday, same time, same Zoom information. We're going to do a little show and tell selected urban features in Europe. This past summer, I spent 3 months in Europe, and I did a lot of documenting on public spaces in Europe. I just love the public places, the plazas, the piazzas, the plazas, the lungomare. These are just some of my favorite attributes of Europe. So that's presentation 4, kind of a purposeful show and tell with the sort of not so subtle message that our cities would be healthier places if we had more of these kind of features. But then we'll take a closer look next week. So what's the goal of this series? Is to provide useful and practical information to advance the cause of paradigm shift. And that practical information applies to lifestyle in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and in our conversations. I'm hoping the information that you gain here is helpful to you, and I certainly would encourage people to build on what I have to say here. I've learned a great deal from what other people have had to say, and hearing people speak, reading what other people's comments. I'm building on what came before me. So this is something a little bit of a relay, and it is participate as you like. So the main points of this series, I'm not going to read all of those that I have here, but I would add that this presentation is going to go to YouTube, and you can watch it on YouTube. And as you know, with YouTube, you can pause and take a closer look anywhere you want. There's a lot of content here in text and visual form. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you follow up with watching this presentation again on YouTube, you can pause and you can take in more. And those links to those YouTube presentations will be found on my website, suburbanpermaculture.org. This is my website here, suburbanpermaculture.org. Alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture already exist at many scales and in many conditions and locations. We've seen some of that in the previous episodes. Progressive organizations and movements have an enormous role to play for bringing out a preferred future. That's kind of a little bit more in the realm of the fifth presentation. And that fifth presentation will also touch on economic and political democracy. As I like to say, positive human potential is our greatest renewable resource. And as we help repair the damage to people, we repair the damage to people and planet at the same time. And there are many benefits to be gained. And this is just a nice little graphic I made. These are just some of the key words and concepts for this series of presentations. I'm not going to read all of these. We've already touched on a few of these. Reduce eco footprints, allies in the community, how to prioritize our time and money. These are all really important concepts for creating a preferred future. So let's just take a quick look at highlights from parts 1 and 2. In part 1, we just took a really quick look. What is the responsibility of an economic system and who decides? I think it's safe to say that our current economic system and the people who have taken it upon themselves to decide are not acting in the best interest of people and planet. I don't think it takes any great intellect to come to that decision, but the well-being of people and planet should be the priority of an economic system. And of course, there's lots of different aspects to well-being. We touched on permaculture. Permaculture is a very powerful, important tool for helping to bring about a preferred future. When I was in Europe, I spent a month in Sardinia. I really like Sardinia, and I connected with a lot of people in Sardinia interested in permaculture. I visited a good number of permaculture sites in Sardinia, and they were with people I didn't know. A friend of mine in Sardinia organized, coordinated these site visits, but I already knew when I met these people, we had a lot in common because they all had a big interest in permaculture. It's something like a new language. Another important highlight from a previous presentation was the describing this quote that's been identified with a number of people such as Dick Cheney, a former vice president, and others too. The American way of life is non-negotiable. And what that says to me is we have a way of life that is significantly wrecking the planet. And we have a way of life, in my opinion, that degrades people's capacity to manifest their higher potentials because we got a consumer culture instead. So what this comment says to me is that this is extremely undemocratic. Who gives these people the platform to make these declarations? And not only the declaration, but they also have a substantial array of tools such as advertising to actually, in a sense, enforce this declaration. Of course, people can live an alternative lifestyle, of course, and gratefully quite a few people do, but I think there are tens of millions of people who can't imagine an alternative to the society that we have because we're not having those kinds of discussions. what is the goal of our society. And that's actually a little bit of a segue into presentation number 5. Who decides? How is that decision made? But that's going to be presentation 5. But I take extreme issue with this statement right here. We also talked about allies, assets, and actions. That was the previous presentation. You see all these images. These are all wonderful stories of people, in a sense, already living at least part-time in a preferred future. These are real life projects where people are manifesting their positive human potentials in many different ways. And they're from all over the country. These are all over the country. Of course, this is in Portland, Oregon, Syracuse, New York, the Bronx, in New York City, Olympia, Washington. Yeah, several from Portland, but these stories are from all over the country. So that's in a previous episode. I just love these stories, positive stuff people are already engaged with. This is another really important item. How do we pay for the changes we'd like to see? And to me, that means how do we prioritize what we do with our time and money? Do we put our time and money into helping to bring about a preferred future, or do we put our time and money that helps perpetuate the status quo and the conditions that many of us would like to leave behind? How do we prioritize our time and money is a huge part of how we move towards a preferred future. This virtuous triangle, I like the term allies, assets, and actions. And what this means is that when you have two of these parts of the triangle working together, you create more of the third. Actions and assets create more allies. Allies and assets create more actions. I like this virtuous triangle. And another item we looked at, this is actually the last final highlight from the previous presentations, ecological footprints. Of course, we know what that term means. This particular location on the internet is the footprint calculator, and you can answer the questions that the calculator asks you about your lifestyle, your transportation, where do you live, your diet, how do you spend your time and money. I wouldn't say that this calculator is the final word, but it certainly is very interesting. It's very educational, but it will give you a product for your lifestyle. It will tell you how many planet Earth would it take for everybody in the world to live like you. And that can be a surprising number. Of course, the average for the United States, and I've seen this in kind of a number of places. And once again, this isn't the final word, but I think we've all heard that if everybody in the world were to live like the average American, we would take something like 5 planet Earths. And of course, that's one of the reasons we've got so many problems, environmental, social, economic, political problems, is we live in a supersized society where excess consumption is basically encouraged and celebrated. So the ecological footprint is an educational tool. So, okay, that's enough of the highlights from previous episodes. And you can find those episodes, once again, links on my website, suburbanpermaculture.org. They're on YouTube. So this is a good story. I love this. This is East Blair Housing Co-op in Eugene and block planning. Block planning is a land use redevelopment tool. Interestingly, the city of Eugene recognizes block planning, and probably other cities do too. They might call it by a different name. The city of Eugene actually employed a professional almost 40 years ago to try to get this idea out into the community. Should be doing that. It should be a priority right now, block planning. So what we have here, we're looking at this graphic, and this is an idealized example of block planning. This is not a real project right here, but it has different features that block planning could make available to those involved with making the plan. So here we see a couple blocks, and it's a typical, could be anywhere in the United States, fairly low residential density. This particular illustration here is probably in a neighborhood that dates to the 40s, but this could be applied really almost anywhere. But this is just one example. So what you see here, the yellow on this side is the pavement that goes away with the block planning. These red buildings here, that's just for reference. That's to tell you that's the same building as these right here. The green over here could be edible landscaping that doesn't exist over here. The blue on this, the idealized after, those are new buildings that don't exist over here on other side, on the before side. So a block plan is a land use scheme that is made up by the people who live on the block and the property owners of the block. And the block plan is a process. It's a process that, to my knowledge, hasn't been completely consummated anywhere, because it is a big project to rework the block to make better use of what's already there and to improve the well-being of the people who live on the block, the environment, resilience, preparedness. The block plan can manifest the interest of those people who live on the block and the property owners of the block. When you have a block plan, as this was managed in Eugene, you go to the city, you work with a neighborhood association, you probably have professionals working with you. In my thinking, the city should assist people to make a block plan happen, because there's lots of benefits that that help bring about the kinds of goals that we have here in Eugene to live more ecologically responsible, even in a mainstream sense. But with a block plan, city rules and regulations don't go away, but they become more flexible. It's what we would call performance compliance. Instead of the city saying, this is how you're going to take care of stormwater, this is how you're going to take care of landscaping or height the buildings, different features that a block plan could include, the city will say, here's the outcomes we want, show us how you're going to do it. That's a big change. That's called performance compliance. And what normally would happen if you were just doing these changes on your own single property, the city would tell you what to do, and you wouldn't really have very much choice in how you satisfy those rules and regulations. So that means a block plan can be much more creative in what the design is. The city just wants to know, how are you going to address this issue? And it doesn't so much tell you what to do. That's a big deal right there. So this picture here is East Blair Housing Co-op. And East Blair is in another neighborhood here in Eugene. It dates back to 1984. And East Blair, the co-op, owns about 8 properties. You see the properties here in purple. They're not all totally next to each other. But what this allows East Blair to do is, because the co-op owns all these properties, it can develop and manage these properties in a coordinated way. And this simulates a block plan. This is not a block plan, but it has features that simulate a block plan. So when we do site tours here in Eugene, we were just at East Blair 3 weeks ago. There were 20 of us to go see East Blair in terms of what a wonderful place it is, and lots of responsible social, economic, environmental ways, but also to explain that East Blair has many attributes of a block plan. So let's just take a little bit of a look. This is actually one of our site tours. East Blair can manage the properties in the best way it can. And this particular spot right here where we're standing, there's a picnic table. This is a fire pit. This is the location of lots of parties over the years. I've been to some great parties here. There's edible landscaping. It's green. It's a nice, quiet place. It's available for people who live at East Blair to come out and have a picnic or meet somebody out here in this space. This location used to be a parking lot. I've seen it as a parking lot when I first moved to Eugene. They were in the act of de-paving this. So East Blair was able to say, we don't want a parking lot there. We want to have a social space, edible landscaping, a nice positive location. They didn't ask the city about it. They just de-paved it. And the city was unhappy with what they did, but there were no major consequences to turning this, what used to be not a big parking lot. I think it had space for about 8 or 10 cars. This was not a big parking lot. So there are some other benefits from this coordinated land use management at East Blair. One, for example, is there's about 50 people who live at East Blair. It's not a huge co-op, but it's a good size co-op. It's a pretty big co-op. And this is a tool room. The cooperative has a shared tool room. You don't have to buy all these tools yourself. There's a way to borrow tools for people in the co-op. This is a wonderful amenity of block planning. It creates a capacity to cooperate and collaborate, and that translates into saving money. It also importantly translates into the opportunity to reduce ecological footprints as well. What you see here is a garden area. One property of the co-op has a big backyard, and for people in other parts of the co-op who don't have that kind of space, they can use some space in that backyard. It's all part of the co-op. So part of the co-op is higher residential density. And so they don't have a place to have a garden, but they can have a garden somewhere else in the co-op. This picture right here, this is actually the backyard of a newer property. This property was bought, I think, maybe about 3 years ago. And I'd seen this property before the co-op bought it. And this yard and garden right here was just, it was just kind of a dog run. It wasn't a wreck, but there wasn't really anything of much value that anybody was doing anything with. So the co-op was able to expand its size and bought this property. And this is actually a picture a couple of years ago. The property The garden looks a lot better. It even looks much better now than it did then. But the co-op was able to improve the use and the productivity of that particular property. Block planning could facilitate that in a much larger scale if the entire block was making these kinds of changes together. The co-op has a community house. It's a little bit like a lower budget retrofit co-housing. East Blair does have some aspects of co-housing, but it is more lower budget. But a block plan could designate some structures on the block that might be a community place, or maybe a little library, or some types of workshops. A block plan could facilitate all kinds of positive uses for the block, even certainly more so than what you see right here. So block planning is a wonderful tool, and there are certainly opportunities for neighbors to practice these kinds of cooperations without a block plan too. You don't need a block plan. You can take down the fence. Neighbors can share tools. Neighbors, once they meet each other, can do anything they want to improve their quality of life in terms of resilience, reducing eco footprints, preparedness for the unknown. So block planning is a way for a larger scale rethinking of how the block is used. And of course, when you do a block plan, it's all legal, and you don't have to worry about the city coming back and saying you can't do it. Is it complicated? Well, I suppose it probably is. I haven't had personal experience with it myself, but the city of Eugene recognizes block planning. Here's another location in Davis, California. It's called N Street Co-op. This is in Davis, California. I took this photo. I visited there one time. And Davis is a good example of something of a block plan also. There's a history here, of course, but more up to date, the people here have taken fences down between these properties. This is a 1960s era suburban neighborhood. So somebody had the idea of taking fences down, and over a period of time, when properties came up for sale, people bought these properties who were also interested in this kind of rethinking what a suburban neighborhood could be like. And so N Street Co-op is another example of what a block plan could look like. Great. So that's what I want to say about block planning. Again, any group of neighbors could make some of these kind of changes just among themselves with no permission at all. But a block plan is for a larger scale. So pushing back on cars, certainly one of my favorite topics. I see cars as being one of the most iconic products of the consumer culture. It's difficult to live without a car, absolutely, because that's the intention. The whole intention with cars is to create a society and a land use protocol that makes living without a car difficult. This is not an accident. We'll just do a very brief little history. Suburbia is an integral part of the car culture. Suburbia, as we know it, would not happen without cars, but suburbia is not an accident either. During the Great Depression, following World War II, government housing policy favored suburbia at the expense of inner city locations. Of course, we all know about National City Lines bought all these trolley companies back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and purposefully trashed the trolleys to replace them with buses and cars. And of course, the interstate highway system from the mid 1950s is another assist to cars and suburbia. Certainly one of the largest public work projects ever in the world history. And it certainly had far-reaching consequences. We're hearing a little bit more in the news about these urban freeways that were usually built in the 50s, 60s, 70s that went through minority neighborhoods, ruined neighborhoods, so mostly white suburban commuters could drive their cars downtown. That's the short story of a lot of urban freeways. This particular in Detroit, of course, the interstate highways opened up a lot more room for development thanks to cars. That was a big benefit to building suburbia. And part of the history is that cars were promoted. The 1939 World's Fair, General Motors had an exhibit showing the city of the future as seen from 1939, full of cars like this model right here. Well, that kind of happened. Levittown, New York, Long Island was a big milestone in suburban history, industrialized suburbia. And this picture here of the Los Angeles area shows what Pacific Electric looked like, one of the world's best examples of electric public transportation, this being in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. You could go all the way from downtown LA out to Riverside or way down south along the coast. And of course, the system was bought and purposefully not maintained to facilitate a change from public transportation to more private transportation. That's a complex issue. Of course, there are books written about national city lines. There was a trend towards more cars and less to public transportation, but that was a trend that had reflected the financial interests of companies and businesses that had an interest in cars and building freeways and building suburbia. It's not an accident. This is just what a typical street looks like. This just happens to be Toronto. Look at all the space taken up by cars. There's more people on the sidewalks than there are in the cars. And this is just typical. When I first saw this graphic right here, I was totally amazed. This is Atlanta, Georgia, the footprint of Atlanta, Georgia, and this is the footprint of Barcelona, Spain. And I visited Barcelona this summer. I loved it. I love Barcelona. They are in scale, and the two cities have approximately the same populations. Atlanta's urban footprint is something like 25 times the size of Barcelona. And that it represents an enormous misuse of urban space. This, of course, is automobile dominated. This is all suburban land use right here. Barcelona is a dense city, even by European standards. There's a lot to be said for greater density. And of course, its public transportation is far different. The whole urban experience here in Barcelona is so different. Next week, I'll talk a little bit about Barcelona because I stayed in a really nice neighborhood that I haven't seen anything in the United States that looks like Gracia neighborhood in central Barcelona, but that's next week, a future episode. So this is kind of what we have. This is Dallas, Texas. This is certainly a very impressive bit of highway engineering. It's also a very expensive type of highway engineering. And it is an enormous misapplication of money, given what automobiles are doing to our environment, and I would say also to our culture as well. And this is why we have all those freeways. This is Las Vegas suburbia right here. Just amazing that this exists. And a friend just sent me these pictures just yesterday. I had to use these pictures. Is it as grim as this? Well, you know, pretty close. This is a drive-in coffee place, who knows where, somewhere in the United States. I've seen some that aren't quite as bad as that, but it is symptomatic. And of course, when I was in Europe, I saw lots of this, the cafe culture, where people are out on the sidewalk along a street that can be few cars or oftentimes no cars at all. But just the contrast between these two pictures and what they represent in terms of the way people think and the way people are basically, in my thinking, socially engineered to accept something like this, because of course the social and economic and environmental footprint of this type of lifestyle is, needless to say, a lot more than this one right here. So external costs, we talked about external costs in an earlier presentation. External costs mean when we pay for something, we don't really pay an honest price, given the damage that product or service might do to public health or the environment. So of course, we're talking about cars. These are just some of the external costs of automobiles, climate change, the poor use of energy and resources in suburbia, air pollution, traffic accidents that injure lots of people, billions and billions in repair, lost time in congestion, road rage, a military that exists to facilitate the global commerce that helps the car culture and our consumer culture. And of course, this picture here from Ecuador, the Amazon, Ecuador, the lifestyles of millions of people all over the world are negatively impacted by the use of automobiles. So this is another reason why I like the idea of pushing back on cars. This is a picture I came across. I was watching a video. This is Pompeii. This dates back almost 2,000 years. I've been to Pompeii, actually, although I didn't see this exact location. But this is a street right here. And what these items here are called bollards. They're the same item as this right here. And actually, these bollards perform the same function. Behind the person taking the photo here is a big piazza. It's a big open public space where people are walking around. And this is like 2,000 years ago. This is ancient Pompeii. The bollards here serve to prevent wheeled vehicles from going from this street here into that pedestrian public space. That's exactly what's happening here. Right here on one side of these bollards, you can have cars, and on the other side, you don't have cars. Well, of course, Pompeii didn't have cars, but they had wheeled vehicles, most likely pulled by animals, and their urban planners decided that we don't want that type of traffic in a place where there's people walking. So this is an early form of not car pushback, but pushback on wheeled vehicles. People actually have been pushing back on cars for quite some time. Following World War II, Europe was, needless to say, severely damaged with all the bombing and all the war. There was a period following World War II when their rebuilding was being encouraged and helped to a considerable degree by America's Marshall Plan and other types of funding mechanisms to rebuild. And in the 50s and 60s, part of that rebuilding was with the intention of, to some degree, recreating American lifestyle in Europe. And of course, that means cars. I've actually seen a draft idea for what a freeway superimposed on Amsterdam would look like. It didn't happen, but there was an effort to have Europe become more of an automobile society than what it was before the war, because there's lots of money to be made by building cars and all the industries and jobs that go along with cars. But this picture shows biking in Copenhagen in the 50s, when cars were on the ascendancy in Europe in the 60s up to the 70s. This demonstration here in Holland was calling attention to the number of school kids who were being hit by cars on their way to school. They're saying, we don't want this. We don't want this car culture. We don't want our children being run over by cars. Interestingly, there were similar demonstrations in the United States for exactly the same reason. This picture here shows a big demonstration in Copenhagen, this being in the 70s, of people saying, we don't want to be dominated by automobiles. The Arab oil embargo helped bring out the public to say, we don't want a society that is so requiring and dependent on automobiles. Europe pushed back in the 70s and 80s. It's a very interesting history. You can find more about it online, but it's not an accident that Europe is much more friendly to people, bikes and pedestrians and public transportation. It's not an accident. They worked on it. And it's certainly not to say Europe is perfect. Of course it's not, but it's way different from virtually anywhere in the United States. And you may have seen this graphic right here, how much space is taken up by respective modes of transportation. Of course, cars take up the most room. So a little bit more pushing back here. This is my own house right here. This is what my place looked like when I bought it 22 years ago. It was a modest house. We had a good look at what I've done with my property in a previous presentation. So we're not going to look much more than just beyond the driveway. I pushed back on cars. One of the first things I did with my house is a friend and I rented a cement saw and we took out the driveway. And what you see here is all that's left of my driveway. That's a little bit of pushing back on cars at the home scale. Of course, we saw this picture before. That is East Blair Housing Co-op. As I mentioned, that was a parking lot pushing back on cars. This is one of my favorite places in Portland, Oregon, Kailash Eco Village. And oh, you can go to their website. They have a wonderful website, kailashecovillage.org. I've been here. This was a parking lot that was depaved, and this is what it turned into right there. This beautiful garden, Kailash Eco Village. People can adopt a eco-friendly lifestyle. These are a couple of happy people in Portland, and they're car free, and this is how they're taking care of some of their needs. Look at this trailer right here. Marisha is a permaculture teacher. Zane is an accomplice of her. And they've, I think, been to some type of street market where they were selling plants. So this is what a car-free lifestyle can look like. It comes in many varieties. This is what Zane and Marisha have come up with, and that's great. Pushing back on cars, another location, another entity in Portland, City Repair. Much of the agenda of this nonprofit City Repair is pushing back on cars. Of course, one of their most famous actions is painting an intersection to slow traffic down, to try to recreate a little bit of the social aspect of a public place, painting an intersection. And of course, this model right here shows it's got movable pieces that people can participate. And this is actually a little bit like block planning right here. How can you rearrange the block so that it's more healthy and makes better use of the land and reduces ecological footprints? City Repair is a wonderful entity for pushing back on cars. This is comparative. This chart shows bicycle usage in different cities and different parts of the world. The further out this line goes on the graph, that's the better the city is. And of course, you have Amsterdam and Copenhagen are way out here on the right. There are places that are even better. There's Groningen right there. I spent some time in Groningen. We'll see some pictures from Groningen next week. I was there. That has even more bicycle usage than Amsterdam and Copenhagen. This is Europe here, England right here, Canada, the United States, and Australia. So in this country, Portland, Oregon is generally thought of as being one of our best cities for usage of bicycles. And compared to other cities in the United States, Portland is pretty good. I've biked some in Portland for sure. Comparatively, it's a good city for bikes in the context of the United States. This is Portland right here. Portland, this is what Portland would be in compared to other cities in Denmark or in Holland or in Germany. It's really not very good compared to those cities in Europe. I think part of our issue is we need to be more honest with the impacts of the car culture and what's that's done to our society and even our capacity to imagine alternatives. So the take-home message is here that places in the US like Madison, like Davis, like Eugene, that are all thought of as being good bike cities are fourth and fifth tier in Northern Europe. They would, in those countries, people would feel sorry for people with bicycle infrastructure and urban design like we have in Eugene. So another pushback that's happened historically, maybe not so much right now, but some years back, was critical mass bike rides. People were coming together and saying, we are traffic, bicycles deserve respect. And critical mass bike rides, according to these posters and information, happened all over the world, and not just in well, Houston, Miami. We had some here in Eugene. They were great fun. Parking day, something else that's happened a bit more in years past, but the idea is to occupy a parking place and do something creative and fun with that parking place instead of having a car there. And this is a picture I took from the internet. And this is, you've got a band, you put down some artificial turf and make something fun here to draw attention to the fact that cars take up an enormous amount of space and it deprives the public from making better use of that space. So this is an effort to illustrate that issue. Parklets. COVID meant that restaurants could move some of their seating outdoors, and that's good. Outdoor seating is ubiquitous in all over Europe, far more so than in the United States. So what's happened here is that this is outdoor seating for a restaurant, and it occupies where there used to be a place for parking a car. And these are other examples here and there all over. Lots of cities have little parklets like this. And it's a small example of pushing back, but it's an important example on pushing back. This is a little parklet right here in Eugene. When COVID was happening, this little couple blocks in downtown Eugene was car free. It was really nice. It's not car free anymore. Eugene, one of the more progressive cities in the country, can't even manage a small amount of pedestrian area downtown. A good story, Harbor Drive in Portland, this in the 60s and 70s. This isn't really an interstate highway, but it's kind of like an interstate highway. You can tell it's divided, but it's not an interstate highway. But the idea presented itself that maybe Portland could remove that highway and make better use of that space. The traffic engineer said, oh, that's going to create problems all over. It's going to be terrible for car drivers. Well, it didn't work out to be so bad for car drivers. Of course, some had to adjust, but that's what that same space looks like now. You can see this bridge here. That's the same bridge here. There would have been cars driving right along here. So the story right here is that the idea was to push back on cars, and this is a nice public place at this point. This is a picture of Eugene, and a friend of mine did a lot of research. Eugene does have some freeways in town like any other American city of this size, but this orange illustrates divided highways, more or less freeways or boulevards that were never built because there was community pushback on these projects. So these orange ones were never built. There are here, those exist, and now they want more money to make this part of this ring road even bigger. That is an inappropriate use. Of course, it's congested. We all know the term induced congestion. You build more highway and it attracts more cars. There's so much momentum and inertia by people making money to continue building highways. And given the trends, climate change and social, political, economic trends, we should be spending that money in a much different way for a very different future. This New York City has a program, a community plaza, where people in the neighborhoods can identify places that might be nice to turn into parks. And that means in this particular location, this was a parking lot, turning it into this particular use right here. This is a great story. There's several dozen community plazas in New York City. Of course, Times Square is the most famous one. But this one here, Corona Heights in Queens, this is the street before, and this is the street during a celebration. Some of these plazas can be temporary, some can be seasonal, some can be permanent. But what this program allows is for people in their neighborhoods, along with the businesses, along with their neighborhood associations, with the people who live in these neighborhoods, to identify places that could receive an upgrade and improve the quality of life for people in the neighborhood. This is a great story. It empowers people to make their places better places to live, and that oftentimes means pushing back on cars. The Embarcadero Expressway in San Francisco. If you've been to San Francisco, and you don't know the history here, say you haven't been to San Francisco back in the 70s, you would say, oh, what's that? Well, that's a big freeway right next to the ferry building. It doesn't look like that now, but this was intended to be a freeway to connect the Bay Bridge with the Golden Gate Bridge. And the whole freeway was never completely built, but part of it was. This is prime real estate. This should be one of the most valued locations in the city right here. This is the freeway. There were efforts to stop it. They had various public votes. It wasn't being stopped, but finally the Loma Prieta earthquake from 1989 put a stop to this freeway. It damaged the freeway so badly that it forced a more serious public discussion, and there was a decision to take out the freeway. So this is a great example of pushing back on cars in San Francisco. And actually at different points in that period of history, a little bit before, there were other intentions to build other freeways in San Francisco. The panhandle of Golden Gate Park was supposed to be a freeway. It was never built. Imagine if these freeways had been built, and they invariably damaged the quality of life in a city. This is a good story. This is Los Angeles. This is a place here called Los Angeles Eco Village. About 40 people live here, and their ideal is to live more ecologically, more cooperatively, have fun, and be good neighbors, and work with each other for a improved quality of life here in a very commercial urban part of Los Angeles right here. Well, they're sort of person who has had a lot to do with the Eco Village, Lois. What a dynamo she is. Her ideas, one of them right now, the community has bought this old gas station right here. It was closed. It was an eyesore. This is a corner of the gas station right here, kind of from a previous era. They're turning it into a community center. This gas station is becoming a community center for neighborhood culture, for meeting spaces, for people to come together and have a good time. This street right here is in front of the Eco Village, and on the other side of the street is a parking lot. There's really not any much big use of this street right here. I was amazed to find out that Los Angeles has a law that allows people the opportunity under certain circumstances and certainly very limited circumstances to actually close a street and put an end to the street. So because this little bit of street right here is only used by the Eco Village, and this side of the street's a parking lot, there's nobody living over here. LA Eco Village is in the process of turning this into a pedestrian mall to remove cars from this street and turn this into just a nice place where people can hang out and the neighborhood can have events, and it can be a bit quieter and hopefully even improve the air quality a little bit. This is intended to become a plaza where you wouldn't have automobile traffic there, perhaps an emergency vehicle, but not just ongoing traffic right there. That's a really good story. We've got a few more of these to look at. These are just great pictures. I love showing these pictures. Southwest Corridor in Boston. This would have been an 8-lane freeway. The people in Jamaica Plains, the neighborhoods nearby said, we don't want your freeway. They had already bought the property and were already moving buildings out of the way. The freeway was never built. This is a picture of what would have been a freeway. It's a bikeway. There's a train corridor. There's playgrounds. There's community gardens. all this is this kind of almost 5 mile long linear park that could have been a freeway, but instead is a benefit to the neighborhood. Copenhagen, we're taking a look at Europe. Copenhagen, of course, known for its being friendly to bicycles. These are not just the bicycles here in the center of town. Each one of these rings, that's 4 miles out, that's 9 miles out from the center of Copenhagen. And of course, Copenhagen's on the water, so there's nothing out here in the bay. But they're working on a network like spokes to facilitate people from these outlying areas to be able to commute into town. 9 miles, if you're on a bikeway that's separate from the automobiles and it's safe and you feel comfortable being on that bikeway, is not very far at all. That's 30, 40 minutes for a lot of people on a bike. That's really not a very much of a distance. So the idea here, not just to have bikes in the center part of town, but going out into the suburban areas too. This is some pictures of Groningen. I took these pictures actually when I was there this past summer, and I am wanting to move that down. Okay, there we go. This is in the central part of Groningen, not even really in the middle of town, but you can see all the bikes here. There's not very many cars. There are places in central Groningen that are car-free, where you can't take a car at all. These are pedestrian areas. And many of the other areas that are near downtown, like this one here, you see some cars, but not very many. You see a lot more bicycles. And of course, you see all these people out there in their outdoor cafes, just all over the place in Groningen. My friend and I took a bike ride outside of town nearby. This is a big lake. We biked around, and this is a restaurant. You can just stop in for a pastry or coffee or tea and just look at the patronage for this restaurant. It's bicycle access. I'm sure that people to make deliveries, you can drive a vehicle here to make deliveries to the restaurant, but essentially it's in a car-free area. So these bicycle amenities are definitely beyond just the downtown areas. So here's some other spots, other locations in Holland. This is Amsterdam. I biked from Amsterdam to a town called Houten. That meant I had to bike through Utrecht. I was on bikeway almost the entire time. I did have to ask directions a lot, but it was about a 35-kilometer bike ride. This is Utrecht. You might see a car go through here occasionally, but just look at the pedestrian culture here, people walking. This isn't even the center part of Utrecht. There are parts of Utrecht that are totally car-free. This is a bicycle interchange between Houten, where I stayed, and Utrecht. Houten is behind me about a kilometer, and Utrecht is ahead of me a couple kilometers. It's only about 4 kilometers between Houten and Utrecht. Houten was a small new town that was built specifically so that it was easy to live in Houten without using a car or minimal use of a car. Part of the new town of Houten is car-free. The central part of Houten is car-free. But also, along with the bikes, there's rail transportation as well. Bikes are not going to do it completely by themselves, of course not. So rail transportation or buses, alternatives to cars, and also just the way the towns are designed can have an enormous consequence on what transportation will work. Another place I visited, this is the Vauban neighborhood of Freiburg, Germany. What you see here, this used to be a French army base. When the Soviet Union went away, the French did too. They said, we don't need to be here anymore. Good luck. And the city of Freiburg obtained this property. This right here is the property, and this is the same place some number of years later. The city of Freiburg purposefully designed a neighborhood of about 1,500 people. About 1,500 people live here. Designed the neighborhood so that it would be easy to live in that neighborhood without owning a car. If you want to have a car, you can still have a car, but there are parts of the neighborhood where you can't take the car, you can't leave the car. You have to put your car in a civic parking garage, and that's going to cost you $15,000 a year. So that's not really encouraging people to have cars right there. Vauban was a great place to visit. I had read and seen videos. This is in the neighborhood right here. I took these pictures here. You can see a tram. Once again, a tram is essential. It goes by every 6 or 7 minutes. It's so often you don't have to think about a schedule. You can just go out here and wait a few minutes for the tram and take it to where you need to go in Freiburg. Instead of having lots of cars and cars taking up space, this is a kid's place right here in Vauban. The neighborhood is extremely kid friendly. I talked with people. Some people moved to Vauban because they didn't want to have a car. Some people moved to Vauban because it's a great place for kids. You can take car space and make it for kids and make it a much healthier place to live. This again is the tram. This again is residential right here. You can drive a car up this right here, but you can't park it. You can make a delivery, but you can't park a car here. I stayed right down below here. I'm just up on one of these terraces right here. So Vauban, again, is a new location that was purposefully designed and intended to make it easier to live without a car. The mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, one of her most important platforms of her running for mayor, this is her second term, is to push back on cars in Paris. And these ideas here, this is a sort of idealized idea of what a car-free, car-limited street might look like in Paris. I did a lot of bike riding around Paris. I'd have to admit, I didn't see anything that looked quite like this. But of course, Paris is a huge city, and it's going to take quite an amount of time to evolve in this direction. There's lots of places in Paris that are becoming more bike friendly. This street here these are kind of like the Parklets. These are all restaurants along here. There's not as much car space here. This would be a bikeway that was superimposed on this this kind of boulevard right here. There's lots of different overlays of bikeways in Paris. Paris, unlike Barcelona, is not built on a grid. It's a challenge to retrofit that place. And of course, millions of people in Paris are just as attached to their cars as they are anywhere else. So some of these changes are not universally popular, but there is pushback in Paris. This is a terrace, a balcony of where I stayed in Paris. You can kind of make out, this is a street. There's a container plant right here on the street at both ends of this street. There's a school up here. My friend's daughter goes to school right up here, right in here. And the idea is the container plants are intended to slow cars down, but there are quite a number of parents of kids at this school who would like to see this street closed to car traffic. So the plant containers are sort of a hopeful move in that direction that's pushing back on cars. This picture is great. The Seine River, certainly one of the icons of Paris is the Seine River. This street right here is all for bicycles and pedestrians. This used to be only for cars. The cars aren't there anymore. This is just prime real estate in Paris. And the decision was made to remove cars from this street right here. So that's what you're looking at. You have a couple of miles along the Seine River that's just for bicycles and pedestrians. And there's places to get a drink, there's places to get a snack. And you're right there along the Seine River. It's really pretty. Oh, back in Holland, I saw places like this. I didn't take this picture myself, but I saw places where there was storage for thousands of bicycles. That's not unusual in Holland. I did not take this picture. This is Beograd, Serbia, although I've been in Beograd many years ago, but this is just this big pedestrian, car-free commercial area in downtown in Beograd. So this pushing back on cars is here and there all over Europe. So one of my destinations was Barcelona, because Barcelona has a project, the Urban Mobility Plan that's been going for, I'm not positive, 10, 12, 14 years, Urban Mobility Plan to try to improve air quality, reduce noise, make Barcelona a more pleasant place to live. As I mentioned, Barcelona is dense residential, even by European standards. So part of the urban mobility plan are super illes. And a super illes is a super island that would, in English, it's become known as super blocks. This is a super block right here. That's a big block. Maybe you find somewhere in San Francisco or Chicago that might be a little bit like this, but there really isn't anything comparable completely to a Barcelona block in the US. You don't have so many tall buildings. It's not like Manhattan. These are all 6, 7, 8-story high buildings. So this is actually a single block right here, but this is a super block. It's 9 residential blocks, and you could have 10, 15,000 people living in an area like this. So what the super block does is the streets on the edge of the block are streets that you can go distance on. You can go through neighborhoods from one side of town to the other on these streets here. But the streets within the super block, only cars that live there, so to speak, cars of the people who live in that block or delivery or emergency vehicles can actually go into the super block. Plus, the speed limit is reduced greatly. Plus, on these streets here, many of them, the space taken up by cars is reduced. You would have a lane of traffic becoming perhaps for pedestrians and bicycles. Even more fascinating is you see this red rectangle, that's an intersection in the super block. These intersections are being transformed into public spaces. For example, a car could go here to here, or it could go from here around here. It can't go through the intersection where you once had cars honking and spewing out exhaust. Some of those locations like this had become playgrounds where there used to be cars. I saw places like this. I've taken pictures of places like this. So the whole idea behind the super block is to reduce use of automobiles to improve public health. And of course, along with the urban mobility plan, they're working on scheduling buses, make buses easier to use. Barcelona has a wonderful metro system. The metro system is being made easier to use. There's commuter rail that goes into Barcelona. All these different forms of transportation are being reworked in an effort to reduce the use of automobiles. It's a huge project. This is one super block right here. There would be something in the realm of 200 super blocks like this to take in all of Barcelona. And of course, you can see that Barcelona's on a grid. This lends itself much more easily to this type of redevelopment. But all cities could be adapting these ideas to their own use. So we're on the home stretch here with pictures. These are photos I took when I was in Barcelona. Imagine this street right here that you see here. That would be one of these streets right here in the blue. This blue right here. That's what this is right here. That's one of those streets. Down here is an intersection. I walked down to this intersection, and where there used to be cars, I kicked a soccer ball with some kids where there used to be cars in that intersection. My friends and I had lunch in this sidewalk cafe right here. This is in the Poblano neighborhood in Barcelona. You can see back behind here, that's a playground. There's a swing set, there's a slide. It's a small playground, but before the super block, this would have been a noisy place full of cars. This was an intersection. Now it's a playground. And part of the urban mobility plan is to improve bicycle infrastructure. This bicycle path goes between two streets. Some people have a problem with a bicycle path going between streets. It worked pretty well for me. There were a lot of people using this path going from Gracia neighborhood to Barceloneta. That's on the Mediterranean. This street here, St. John, which is an important street, a major street in Barcelona. But see, there's a traffic light for bicycles. I found the bicycle infrastructure and safety and enjoyment of riding a bike in Barcelona to be really, really good. Of course, it could be better. And I was in a better part of town also. It's probably not like that everywhere in Barcelona, but they're working on it. There's a lot to do to recover from a city that was, and to a large degree is still dominated by automobiles, but there's big progress in the early going. This is just a typical commercial residential street in Barcelona in the Gracia neighborhood. I saw many streets like this. This part is car-free right here. My friends live about 7 or 8 blocks further up this street. This is Verde in Gracia, and it's walkable. There's grocery stores, there's a copy store, there's the cinema, have glasses made, just normal everyday kinds of needs people have. It's walkable. This is so nice to walk through here. I really enjoyed Barcelona, and this is nothing unusual. This is not a super block. This is just the way this neighborhood is. And I saw lots of places in central Barcelona that were just as nice as that. A few other pictures of Barcelona. I like the term pedestrian culture. This in the older part of Barcelona. La Rambla, of course, is famous. Barcelona, La Rambla, This is a pedestrian area. Can you imagine one of the primary tourist attractions in Barcelona is a place to walk? This is one of the many little neighborhood placas in Barcelona. This is one of my favorite. I spent a good deal of time just enjoying. It's like the neighborhood living room is what this is. Older people, kids play, a couple of outdoor cafes. There's dozens of places like this in Barcelona. And because it's very pedestrian, I made a friend just by sitting on this bench overlooking the Mediterranean. We ended up having a really good talk. This woman who lives in Barcelona, she's actually from Colombia, but because there's nice pedestrian culture design, it helps people meet and make friends. So a couple more pictures here. One of the places I really wanted to go, and I'll get more into this next week with the entire slideshow and presentation will be places in Europe. This is Alghero, Sardinia. You talk about pedestrian culture. These are just beautiful places where there's no cars. Of course, it helps to have the Mediterranean Sea right there, but they've made good use of that natural feature. Of course, there's parts of Alghero that are 1,000 years old. It's got an ancient history, a fascinating history, but I just love these pedestrian places where there just aren't any cars. That's why people like to go visit Alghero, partly for the car-free areas, and of course, partly because of the beaches as well. But back closer to home, this street right here, this is in Eugene. It could be a million different places. Imagine taking this street parking off of the street or millions of others and make streets like this safe for bicycles. For example, having not just a bike lane, but a barrier here to keep cars from going into the bike lane. A lot of people would ride a bicycle if they felt safe riding the bicycle. And there's hundreds of thousands of miles worth of city streets just like this all over the country. To take this street side parking, put these cars somewhere else and make this important street. This is an important street here in Eugene. Make it safe for bicycles so people will use it that way. This is a relatively new bikeway here in Eugene. It does have a curb here to protect it from the cars. This between downtown and the University of Oregon. And finally, part of pushing back on cars is reworking what we already have. This is a suburban shopping area just a mile from where I live. I did this kind of imaginary, what would it be like if we built in the parking lot and we had commercial, useful types of professional services and stores we don't have right now. But with this redevelopment, we'd have those types of services and businesses in what would essentially become a small neighborhood downtown for River Road and for Santa Clara neighborhoods. And up above 3, 4, 5 stories, you'd have more dense urban residential. This would be like a little downtown right here. This parking lot's never completely used. There would need to be some parking for sure, but there's a lot of underperforming space in this suburban shopping area, and that goes for thousands of others just like this all over the country. And then, of course, this is an important street in our neighborhood. That's River Road. Imagine, once again, taking a lane of car traffic and having that for use by bicycles so people felt safe riding their bicycles. We've talked about having bus rapid transit through here, a type of bus that is much more frequent so people don't have to pay attention to a schedule. The bus is frequent enough that people could just back here a half mile away, just walk out to the street and know there's going to be a bus in 5 or 6 minutes that could take them to this nice little downtown that would have some of those pedestrian features like we just saw in those other places. So there's tens of thousands of places in the United States that are just like this. This could be a different form of economic development, transforming suburbia, turning places like this into urban type usage that allows people more opportunity to take care of their needs without using a car. There's a lot of economic potential for retrofitting what we have to be more friendly to people and planet. So another presentation, I just did a good bit of rethinking of what I was going to present with this presentation. And I decided I'm going to rework that. So I will put some information out about that when the time comes. I just did not, the more I got into it, the more I said, I need to spend more time with turning these ideas into visuals that I can explain. So finally, our last picture, permaculture in action towards a preferred future, many, many benefits. Reduces damage to the environment, helps build civic culture. We can help bring it about by how we prioritize our time and money, create volunteer opportunities, social and political power of business that doesn't fit a sustainable future. If we don't buy those products, then those products will go away. That's part of the purposeful boycott. A preferred future provides us opportunity to manifest more our own personal human potentials, but to benefit ourselves and the community as well. That's another presentation. So I appreciate your being here, listening to the presentation. This will go on YouTube, and I will put info out on that. And please share that information when you see it with your friends. There's wonderful, important content in all of these presentations. So this is Jan Spencer in Eugene. Hope you have a good day. Thanks for being here. Be well.